are hopefully going to cover tonight about 500 years. So last week we did 2,500. This week we're only doing 5, which may give you a sense of how important the 5 are versus the 25 if we were able to breeze through that much time. We're basically looking at the period of time of the kings of Israel. From the beginning of the kingship to the destruction of the first temple. That would be the period, even though there were kings somewhat after the destruction of the first temple, there were more puppet-like. So that's our goal tonight. And I promised I would do this last week before this week. And that is, there are a lot of people around the table. Some of you don't know each other. It always amazes me in small congregations when people don't know each other. But it does happen. So I'm going to ask you to go around the room and introduce yourselves. And that's not a part of the test. And there won't be a quiz next week on the names. But at least, tell us who you are.
Paul Kaufman, live in Wilton. Was I supposed to say more?
No, that's
That's good.
That's good. Paul's wife Eileen. I know some of you, not all of you, so it's nice to meet all of you.
I'm Michelle Skirton, we live in Reading.
Johnson Scruton, living in the same. Moses Salas Center, from Milton.
Sue Hagan in Westport. Rosalind Kopstein, Reading.
Connie Heff, Ridgefield.
Michael Heft, also Ridgefield.
Ronald Ross, Ridgefield. Kiki Tom, Weston. Rita Miller, Ridgefield.
Bruce Miller, same.
Brenda Lasso in Richfield.
Jenny Lasso, same place.
Great. Thank you all for being here. For those who are new, welcome. For those who return, God bless you. Tonight's journey, we're going to pick up kind of where we left off with the kings. Because the period of kings, as I said last week, is where most scholarly opinions would say history begins. Because you begin to see the development of secondary and tertiary evidence of actual events, of communication, of decrees and documents, and history begins to really take shape and form. And I say that as opposed to the biblical history that we went through last week, which has no secondary or tertiary support. There is no evidence, although as Bruce and I are reading, I said this last week, we're reading the Kuzari. The Kuzari is a document, it's kind of almost a novel, written by Judah Halevi about the conversion of the Khazar people, which was a historical event in the 8th century. But he's writing about it 400 years later as if he was there. And in the 9th century, the conversion. And in the document, he's talking to different people. A philosopher, a Christian scholar, a Muslim scholar, and a rabbi. Each step along the way, there's something that's missing until he gets to the rabbi and finds everything that he's looking for. But what was missing from the Christian scholar and the Muslim scholar was evidence. Where's mass revelation? Where are there? Show me an event where there's 600,000 people standing at Mount Sinai in the Quran, and it doesn't exist. There is no event like that. The Quran refers to the Old Testament events, to the Hebrew Bible events, but there's no event like that And so there's no evidence. And so, Halevi says that's the reason why those traditions are less valid. They have less foundation because there's no mass event. But when we look to the kings, we see a whole lot of exchange, flow between cultures and traditions, the development of documents and dialogue. And that creates in and of itself its own kind of historicity. So where do we get the kings from? And I thought I'd share a little bit of Tanakh with you tonight. And we're talking about a guy named Samuel. Who was Samuel? Samuel was a prophet, right? And Samuel kind of ministered over the tribes of Israel. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel. His second son's name was Abijah, and they sat as judges in Beersheba. But his sons did not follow his ways. They were bent on gain. They accepted bribes. They subverted justice. So all the elders of Israel assembled and came to Samuel in Ramah. And they said to him, "You've grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways. Therefore appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations." So what was the reason they wanted a king? Because the person that they had relied on, the judge, the honest justice, the honest arbiter, had grown old. The next generation didn't have the same set of values as the previous generation. And so, instead of saying to Samuel, "Give us a better judge," "Depose your sons," "Come out of retirement, Samuel, do something," they said, "Give us a king." Samuel was displeased that they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Yeah.
What roles did the king have that the judge didn't, since he's obviously leading everyone right?
Well, we don't know because there was no king before him.
Right.
So the judge was kind of a regional arbiter of disputes between tribes, between individuals.
So he wouldn't necessarily set policy, but just judge what was going on.
Well, the policy was Torah. So the rules, the laws were the mitzvot in Torah. That's what their society was run by. When Samuel was judge, he would have to arbor, between person A and person B over who owns the field.
Yeah.
Okay. So a lot of it's civil, some of it criminal. Although the evidence of criminal justice in the Tanakh is very minimal, because it's the Talmud that says later on that a court that sentences one person to death in 70 years is a murderous court. Even though they could, because they had certain laws that if you broke them, they were punishable by death, stoning predominantly. The actual following of that ruling was so minimal that most of the judges spent their time solving land disputes between people.
So when they're asking for a king, what are they asking for that the judge can give it?
So what does a king do that's different than a judge? The king is a singular figure. So, if you don't like the ruling of one judge, what is your option? You can go to another judge. But if there's a king, there's no one else. So if you have a corrupt judge, yes, you can go to another judge. But if 7 out of 10 judges are corrupt, the odds of you getting to the one that's not is very small. And at the time following Samuel's retirement, the text is saying a lot of corrupt judges.
And I guess it's more the other way. You can always find a corrupt judge who says that other judge, that may be honest, has been ruling my corrupt one.
Well,
In terms of the dispute resolution, it seems like the more powerful guy just plain old sits there and says, I win.
could be.
There also seems to be a big difference that a judge is sort of bottom up, and a king is top down, in the sense that you go to a judge, or if there's a dispute, some people could go to a judge, whereas when I think of a king, I think of setting policy from the top, and it's just sort of turns things upside down.
So the biggest piece about a king is that a king, and this is what we're going to get to, a king is appointed by God. The judge is appointed by man. And so while the judges in the Bible, like Deborah and Samuel, these people had a divine sense of purpose. Samuel appointed his sons to follow him. God did not. But it's very clear that a king is going to be appointed by God. And Samuel makes that very clear when he says, Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord replied to Samuel. So that the person that God is going to choose to be the king is going to be a divine choice and a divine sense of anointing. The word Mashiach, which we translate as Messiah, actually comes from the process of anointing a king, pouring oil. Mashach, Moses poured out. Moses was poured out of the Nile. A king is Mashach. Oil is poured on them as a consecrating task. But God is the chooser. And so what the people are saying is, we need something more than we have. The problem, and we'll hear it from Samuel, is of the old adage, be careful what you ask for one day you may receive it. And so Samuel prays to God. The Lord replied to Samuel, heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you, for it is not you that they have rejected. It is me they have rejected as their king. Like everything else they have done ever since I brought them out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and worshiping other gods, so are they doing to you. Heed their demand, but warn them solemnly and tell them about the practices of any king who will rule over you. And so Samuel does that. He informs them, and he concludes this long kind of job description of the king by saying, the day will come when you cry out because of the king, whom you yourselves have chosen, and the Lord will not answer you on that day. And so the tension in the text and in history was a transformational tension, or a difference, as we said last week, a dissimilarity between Israel and all the other cultures. So Israel did not have a king because their king was
God.
Melech HaMelachim, King of Kings, God. And now we have said we need a king. We need an earthly king. All right? Like all the other peoples. So assimilation,
Right.
assimilation creates its own pressure on this earthly king. And then God says, you'll rue the day that you asked for this king. And indeed, that's what happens. So how do they know? The day before Saul came, the Lord revealed the following to Samuel. At this time tomorrow I will send you a man from the territory of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him ruler of my people Israel. He will deliver my people from the hands of the Philistines, for I have taken note of my people, their outcry has come to me. And wouldn't you know, boom, in walks Saul. Saul is the king. Now the process of choosing Saul was more Samuel telling to the people, this is what God told me. That this guy's going to walk in the door. And whoever that guy is, that's the king. And Saul walks in the door. Now, could the people have said, no, he's not the king we wanted? No, at that point the die was cast. They had already overstepped their boundaries by asking for a king when God had been serving, when God was the king. And so Saul becomes king of Israel. Now, Israel at this point, right now I have this map over here, was united. There was not a division, north, south, east, or west. Israel was united. We were tribal. If you look at the map of the tribes, you'll see that it was a tribal system. Everybody had their locations, and now suddenly this king, Saul, was going to rule over this entire territory. But it's hard to hold on to territory. And the more spread out territory becomes, the harder it is to hold it all together. And as we know, the people who live furthest from the center feel the most disenfranchised. We're not wanted, we're not loved. We can't get there. We can't be a part. And so they begin to create for themselves different customs and traditions. Because if indeed the only place worship could happen was in the tent of meeting, where was the tent of meeting? Jerusalem didn't exist. So where was Saul's home base? Saul was a Benjaminite. So in the tribal area of Benjamin, which is south of Jerusalem, that's where the tent of meeting rested. And so everyone in the north, far away from the tent of meeting, was totally disconnected from worship. Imagine if, in order to pray, you had to go to Richmond, Virginia, from where you are. How many of you would make that trip regularly? Very difficult. All right? The distances were huge. Oftentimes taking people away from their livelihoods for weeks in order to travel the great distance from somewhere in the northern border of Israel, all the way south.
Real question, the request for a king, did that come from all the tribes, or was it for more of a centrally based tribe? Because you wonder about how all the tribes were united in wanting a king or needing a king.
Right, so we can assume in the period of the Judges, especially with Samuel, for whom we have a whole lot of text, Samuel was a big unifier. He was a very righteous judge. He brought people together. And he seemed to have a pretty large following. He just had a few stonks for sons. And they took advantage of their place and position. So we have to assume that the cry wasn't from a narrow few, that this was some kind of corporate plea from all the people around him, or at least in the area where he was, because, they wanted a king. They wanted to be, the real claim was they wanted to be like everybody else. Everybody else had a king. We didn't have a king. We had Moses, and Moses died, and Joshua led us in. And so then we had this amorphous existence, and suddenly we have judges. And the judges are kind of these regional magistrates. And they went to war for us. And there were judges that were bigger than the regions, like Deborah, last week's Haftarah, or Samuel, who is in this, in this section. And they served more than just a regional focus. They were the spiritual head of the people. They were the precursors to the prophets. And so because they had God's ear, they could turn to God for answers in ways that the regional or sub-regional judges, they just couldn't do. So I believe this cry is from a large group of people. And Samuel does try to disabuse them of it. You don't want to do that. But they weren't going to hear him.
One of the things that I would assume a king could do would be to make alliances and treaties with other powers or countries in the area and marry their daughter to bind them together. Was that part of this feeling for a king, or was it just we want to be? Obviously, the judges probably didn't do that.
So here, let me read you this is the job description that Samuel shares. This will be the practice of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them as his charioteers and horsemen. They will serve as outrunners for his chariots. He will appoint them as his chiefs of thousands and of 50s. For they will have to plow his fields, reap his harvest, make his weapons, and the equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters as perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He will seize your choice fields, vineyards, and olive groves and give them to his courtiers. He will take 1/10 part of your grain and vintage and give it to his eunuchs and courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves, your choice young men and your asses, and put them to work for him. He will take 1/10 part of your flocks, and you shall become his slaves. So Samuel's idea of what a king would do, not a great idea. But again, the people were saying, we want a king. We want a king. What did a king bring? What was the period of Judges all about? Still a very violent time. There were constant battles, constant invasions by all these people all around Israel. Israel was a trade route, a pathway from east to west and north to south. That's all that ever really was. And so everybody marched through it on the way to some big military conquest. And so the judges were in many ways military leaders as well. And a king, well, a king could be a bigger military leader. He would have a real army. He would really defend us from the Phoenicians or the Philistines or the Moabites. A king could change our world. And indeed he did.
Why didn't there have been judges before Samuel? Why at this time do the people want a king? Why not just wait till another judge arrives to save the people?
Well, if we went back a little bit further, the Philistines were on a campaign. The Philistines are the power. I'm going to get into a little bit of the balance of power stuff tonight. But if the Philistines are on a march, there's this common enemy that Israel doesn't seem to be doing very well at defeating. The Israelites were terrified of them. And as you remember, well, you know, their big treaty was with a guy named Goliath, who was from a town called Gath, which is right here on the edge of where the Philistines hit this imaginary line across the center of Israel. So about right there. And Gath, you know, Goliath was this big guy, and, you know, fierce fighter, you know, and, you know, and so they're very afraid of being destroyed by the Philistines. And so from their perspective, if Samuel is retired and his sons are weak, no one's there to defend them. And waiting for the next judge somewhere down the line, the battle will be over and everything will have been lost. And so that's really the impetus for saying to Samuel, give us a king. We need a king to circle the wagons and defeat the Philistines. And Saul was chosen. So what do you know about Saul? Anyone read any things about Saul?
He took care of the donkeys or sheep of his father, something, one or the other, or a sheep herder, a shepherd?
That was David. David was the shepherd, who was also a kind of a novice prophet, or, you know, a novice kind of attended to one of the prophets.
Mentally unstable.
Okay.
Yeah, I would think not at this point.
Saul was he was paranoid. Saul was always worried about who was going to take power from him. He was incredibly paranoid. He had someone, he was always looking over his shoulder, thinking who was going to stab him in the back. And, you know, and he was a fierce fighter. To Saul's credit, he did lead the Israelites into battle against the Philistines, and he couldn't count on this little shepherd boy with a slingshot who knocked Goliath to the ground and cut off his head. But Saul was the one who he was ready to charge into battle and face Goliath directly when David volunteered to go in his place.
I seem to remember some story about a well and an ass or so.
There's lots of stories. I don't know that one in particular.
Oh, all right. I'm confused.
Yeah. So David, David wins Saul's favor through his encounter with Saul's son. Saul's son was Jonathan. Now, a lot of text gives there's a whole lot of discussion about, David and Jonathan, and, it says here, when David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan's soul became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. Saul took him, meaning David, into his service that day and would not let him return to his father's house. So, Saul, in many ways, adopted David, but was very distrustful of David. And David, of course, was the one to defeat Goliath in the battle at Kiryat Gat. And in doing so, created an even greater fervor for David than Saul. Saul needed public affirmation. Saul would get public affirmation. Then David would walk in behind him, and David would get greater accolades, a louder cheer, and Saul was terribly challenged by that and felt that David was going to rise up and usurp his kingship. So Saul does what any good paranoid king would do and says to his soldiers, kill David. And what begins now, in 1 Samuel into 2 Samuel, is the story of Saul and his inept soldiers being tricked, missing, not being able to kill David. So, there's story after story. David was here. And Jonathan, Saul's son, is hiding David, moving David around. Michal, Saul's daughter, Saul gave his daughter to David as a wife. She hid David from her father. When David fled, this is the kind of, this whole section reads like a soap opera. Saul gave Michal to someone else as a wife when David was on the run. And it's like, you can't do that. That's, it's one thing to say, your husband's dead so you can marry someone else. But he wasn't dead, he was just gone. And Saul forced her into a second marriage to someone else. So David is on the run, and Saul's own children are on David's side, not on Saul's side. And they end up in the same place at times. And David hides and gets away. David begins to grow in military power as it becomes apparent that Saul is losing it. And so what we have is the beginning of the development of a southern kingdom with Saul and a northern kingdom with David. So David, who's a Benjaminite, who's from the same tribe as Saul, flees from his tribal area because Saul's going to kill him. And he ends up becoming the kind of the hero of the north. While Saul is dragging his armies around the south, looking for David, the north is getting stronger. And David grows in strength, grows in power, till, as the text has, there's a final conflict. And Saul had ordered David killed and then rescinded the order. And David would not kill Saul. You think if someone was going to come and kill you, you'd want to kill them first. David refused. Saul is in a battle, and he dies. Now, he doesn't die all the way. It's like one of these long, drawn-out death scenes. So he's dying for about 7 pages of text. All right? And he's dying, and he's coughing, and he's dying. And then one of David's soldiers kills Saul. David had ordered no one to kill him. So David then orders that soldier killed because he killed Saul. One thing if Saul died from his wounds on his own in the corner under a tree by himself, but someone actually stabbed him and he died.
Was there a story about when Saul was looking for David at night? David snuck into his tent, either cut off some hair or took some paper or something, let him be aware that he could have killed him and he's not looking to?
Yeah, there was a story of that he, because David kept trying to put an end to this kind of death sentence that Saul, by saying, listen, I'm not the guy, I'm not, Saul has Jonathan killed when it became clear that Jonathan tricked his father. It was just Saul became so overly focused on the death of David that he forgot his kingdom, and the southern kingdom declined.
Did you say he killed Jonathan? I didn't hear what you said.
Yes, he didn't kill him, but he had Jonathan sent to battle, or sent into a war, and Jonathan died in battle. But Saul had kind of thrust him into an impossible situation, knowing that would happen. So David becomes king. When Saul dies, David is already kind of anointed king of the north by the tribes up in the north. And when Saul dies, the tribes of the south immediately drop their weapons to follow David. So David then comes to Jerusalem, the city of David, outside of the walls of Jerusalem, where he builds a palace and has the ark brought to the city of David, to this kind of fortress outside of the walls of the old city, but close to the place.
Why was Jerusalem chosen? Was it already an existing stronghold? Was it kind of halfway north and south, so it was kind of favoring?
Well, I would say that there's a whole lot of reasons. One, just the name itself, Yerushalayim, the city of peace. It's a city on top of a hill. It's a very defendable fortress. There is a whole lot of reasons why Jerusalem would make sense to the people. I can't say that there's anything overtly remarkable other than the fact that Jerusalem was only attackable from one direction, and that was the north. From the south, east, and west, Jerusalem sat at the top of a hill. From the north, Jerusalem sits at the end of a long plain. And so the northern side of Jerusalem is the most vulnerable. And having 10 tribes to your north created a great buffer. Created a great buffer, a military, a defensible stronghold. Would it have been better to make Jerusalem Masada on top of a mountain surrounded by nothing? Who knows? But Jerusalem was chosen as the location. There's the mystical reasons. You know, it's the place where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. You know, that's why the dome of the rock is there. The rock upon which supposedly Abraham in the Quran sacrifices Ishmael.
When's the first time that we hear the name Jerusalem in the Bible?
Well, it's in the prophets. It's not in Torah. So it's in the prophets.
How did that tie into Abraham's sacrifice? You know, why is it Jerusalem? Is that just by tradition?
It's not tradition. So in the sacrifice of Isaac, it's called Mount Moriah. Har Moriah, the mountain of seeing.
And there's no other place right now with that name?
And so, from the Jewish perspective, that's where Abraham went to. So he was in Hebron, which is somewhere around there. And he traveled, three days. You get to Jerusalem. You see a mountain. You climb the mountain. That's Jerusalem. And you're good. That's how Jewish tradition has always looked at it. Tradition has a lot to say. But Islam also claims the same place from their reading of the same story. David wants to build the temple. Why does he want to build the temple? Because he is indeed the embodiment of the merging of faith and leadership. So when we look at David, we look at the precursor to the Messiah. Because he merged the two values. Faith leader, political leader. The problem was that in order for David to be the political leader he was, he had to kill hundreds, thousands of people. He had blood on his hands. He had blood on his hands that he could never wash off. And God said to David, you can't build the temple because you have blood on your hands. And the person that builds the temple is not going to be a man of war. And David was, the text says David was okay with it. We know he wasn't okay with it because he kept coming back, just like Moses kept coming back to God and saying, come on, God, let me go across. Just 1 foot. Let me just put 1 toe in the Jordan River. That's all I want, And God said no. And David was the same. Come on, God, let me build it. Let me do this. God said no. So David dies. You know, a couple of very important stories about David, as we know, is the great, thing with Bathsheba and Uriah. So David's in his palace in the city of David. He looks out and he sees Bathsheba on the roof of a building next to the palace. He falls in love with her at first sight. He brings her to the palace. She informs him that she is married. There is no evidence in the text that David actually slept with Bathsheba before they were married. There's a lot of innuendo in the text, but it doesn't say, it doesn't use the words and they knew each other or they slept together. All we know is what happens next is David finds out that her husband's Uriah, and he sends him to the front. And he dies. So now Bathsheba's a widow. She's free to marry, and he marries her. Is he guilt-ridden for Uriah? Doesn't seem to be. David and Bathsheba have a son. Who is that? Solomon. Now Solomon is not David's firstborn. David's firstborn was a guy named, I think it was Adonijah. Huh? Adonijah.
Isn't Adonai plus Jah?
Yeah. Adonijah.
Okay.
But Adonijah was not a very kind person. And in fact, Adonijah, while David was worried about holding the whole kingdom together, Adonijah asked David if he could be a judge in the north. And what he did was he ruled against David over and over again. He, in essence, gave away the kingdom by his rulings. And so everyone loved Adonijah because they would come to him and say, we're told we owe all these taxes or whatever, these tithes, and we can't pay them. And Adonijah would say, yeah, forgive them. And he gave away the kingdom and created for himself this pocket of power. David ultimately had to go into war against his son in the north. And Adonijah was killed. And that's why Solomon becomes king. And as we know, Solomon exhibited factors that made him uniquely qualified. He was a good student, he read his books, he was the king who represented wisdom. And in his rulings, he followed that through. Solomon made treaties, not war. It's not clear, I don't think there's any part of the story of Solomon where he actually picks up a sword, except in the story of the two women with the baby. It's the only time I think in the text that he actually picks up a sword. Does everybody know that story? Okay. And so Solomon is not the man of war, and God says, Solomon, you build the temple. So Solomon builds the grandest expression of faith one could ever imagine. It is composed of multiple buildings, in addition to the temple building itself, there are homages to the crossing of the sea. There's one building that is nothing but a huge pool that is like 10 times the size of an Olympic pool. Inside of a building, elevated off the floor, holding, tens of thousands of gallons of water. A huge, huge thing. And he builds everything. He takes, he's great at creating wealth, and he takes all the wealth of his kingdom and puts it into this project. It's his life work. Solomon's expansionist world was fed by his ability to create treaties with kings, which often involved marriages and led to the acquisition of property and stuff. And Solomon was good at acquiring stuff. And all that stuff came to Jerusalem. Solomon had quarries and forests, and if you read the text, it reads almost like, they're clear-cutting the forests of Lebanon to build all these structures back in Jerusalem. They're strip mining the quarries of limestone to bring all of that stone to Jerusalem. Such a massive building project that, they seem to be collecting stuff from everywhere. Ships coming down the Mediterranean filled with everything they could from Lebanon, where all the cedars were, all the wood they needed for building.
So it was a relative time of peace, not just for Israel, but for the surrounding countries also not.
Right. So Solomon kept marrying and expanding and pushing the boundaries of the kingdom. And there wasn't violence like there was during David or Saul. There was no violence.
Was he the one who built shrines for his wives if they weren't Jewish, and that created a lot of anxiety?
So what happens is Solomon's going to rule forever. And Solomon's children are going to follow in his footsteps. But what happens, seemingly innocently, as Solomon married all these women from all these foreign nations, he thought it best to keep them happy by building shrines to their household gods. And those shrines were often placed in Jerusalem. And God was very unhappy with that. And so God brought Solomon down. Not because Solomon was unfaithful to God, but Solomon wasn't 100% committed to God. So, as Solomon's power began to wane, his son, Rehoboam, was the next in line to be king. And Rehoboam destroyed the United Kingdom of Solomon. And so, as this period of 500 years, we're not done yet, but this first period of United Kingdom comes to an end, the end of the United Kingdom has to do more with the actions of Solomon than anything. Had Solomon remained 100% faithful and committed to only the worship of God in Jerusalem, there might have been a different storyline.
How large was Solomon's kingdom? Did it take in, I guess, Israel, Judea, and did it involve like some areas like Palestine? Or
So if you look at the map set that is in that packet, you look to the second page. So this is Solomon's kingdom. So Solomon's kingdom was this, but then all of Jordan, all of Syria, up into southern Turkey, all of Lebanon going north. So it was a huge piece of territory.
A lot of lives.
Right, a lot of lives.
What was the relative power of Egypt?
So Egypt was weak because 200 years before, the Israelites left. So whether it was a lot or a little or however many becomes irrelevant, Egypt was in a weak cycle. The people, the ones that are building is Assyria to the north. So Assyria is really the next power. So up here, Assyria. And what they are going to do is begin a long campaign, ultimately a 200-year campaign, moving south in stages, which ends with the destruction of the northern kingdom. Let's do this. So Moses had an idea. It's a long time sitting in one place. Stand up. Stretch your legs. Take a breath. Have some cake.
I got you.
The kingdom is now split. And it's split pretty much in half. And we have the northern 10 tribes and the 2 southern tribes. There were the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin. All the other tribes are in the north, and people gravitated to those directions. Rehoboam's first act was he was so opposed to the Solomonic temple that he built in a place called Bethel a second temple. It was opposed because the priests under Solomon had a lot of authority, a lot of power. Rehoboam wanted it all for himself. And he had an idea that what was missing from this temple in the south was this little known thing called a golden calf.
Back to that.
And so he fashioned one, and he put it in Bethel. And it tore the kingdom apart. And that rending of the covenant was, well, it was terribly tragic. Israel and Judah then became enemies. We were in a civil war. And the civil war was over worship. Because if you're in Judah, you're saying the temple is it. There is no second place. And if you're in the north, well, you're saying it's Bethel. We're not listening to the priests of Jerusalem. We're going to have our own world up here. And so the division of the north and south was less over political leadership and more over access to God. And those in the north felt that God could be accessed through the temple in Bethel.
Do you think it makes sense to think if the Torah was really compiled post-exile or by Ezra, that the rebellion in the north with the calf part of it then became part of the narrative of Sinai? I mean, it would make perfect sense, right? If it was a major civil war that tore your country apart, had a calf as a symbol of it, that
Right.
when you come to tell the story of your whole evolution, that this is earlier and part of the more dramatic covenant story.
That book has not been written yet.
There we go.
Go for it, Jeff.
There you go. The tension over faith between the north and the south was huge. We can't even comprehend what that would be like, because for the last 2,000 years, really for the last 2,500 years, we've kind of lived by the philosophy that wherever we are, God is. But before that point, before 2,500 years ago, before the destruction of the first temple, God was in God's holy temple, which was in Jerusalem. And for another group to come out and say, no, God's up here too. God's in Bethel, caused a schism between the tribes.
So is it possible that the destruction of the temple allowed Jews to flourish in diaspora? Become universal?
Right. So that is the response of modern historians.
Yeah.
And also, Josephus writes in 70 that while Titus was burning down the temple, the Pharisees were cheering as the blood of the Sadducees flowed down the steps. That this internal hatred was so strong that the destruction of the temple was inevitable. Now the question could be said, well, was that the same in 586? And I don't think it was. I don't think it was as palpable in 586. But there was still a feeling that the temple had lost its way. So let's back up in time. So Solomon is the 10th century. Let's go into the 9th century. The 9th century, once we have the division, north and south, this is where we really see prophecy begin to take root.
What?
Prophecy. So the prophets themselves were, for the most part, landed, successful, agribusiness kind of people. Most of them came from wealth. A few of them did not. Most of them had means, came from settled families. But they were very well connected to the faith story, to tradition. Why is that important? Because out in the hinterlands in Israel, people were ignorant, unknowledgeable of what Judaism was really teaching. Some thought it was okay to worship a golden calf. Because really, I mean, if it's in the temple in Bethel, it must be okay. They wouldn't put a golden calf in the temple in Bethel if it wasn't okay. And it's the prophets who came along and said, no, it's not okay. Idolatry is the greatest sin. It is the biggest fear we have. And any time we create an idol, we are separating ourselves from God. And the golden calf is an idol. Because God has no form. So the prophets came to teach that message to a people that was uneducated, that were so distant in geography from the temple, because they couldn't get there. And what happened in the north and what the prophets describe is almost a free-for-all. There were Levites who had left Jerusalem when the kingdom split, and they were hawking themselves to communities in the north. Have your own Levite, we'll do sacrifices for you. And home sacrifices were done, which was totally against the temple in Jerusalem. And there are those who would claim that was the logical mutation which gave rise to synagogues. That the period of Solomon's temple was only during the period of Solomon. And that immediately after Solomon, the temple as an institution began to erode because people were so dispersed. Keep in mind, look at that map of Solomon's kingdom. If you were in Turkey and Jewish and a part of Solomon's kingdom, you would never get into Jerusalem. That just wasn't even in your, bag of tricks.
Did Solomon have a specific role religiously to play at the temple?
No, he did not. He was its funder. He was its creator, but he was not a religious figure. Now, there are certain offerings that the king made, but he brought them to the priest to sacrifice. And he does that. It says it in the text. So Solomon never abandoned his faith. His problem was building those shrines for his wives.
And when he conquered territory or grew his kingdom, did he try to convert the people?
Well, so what constituted conversion? Conversion's a rabbinic idea. And even the rabbis disagree on that. By rabbinic, I mean Talmudic. So how did you become a convert to Judaism? Well, one would assume that you could become a convert by marriage. So oftentimes, when Solomon married the princess of some people, everyone in that people converted because He married her, and they were following her, so now they're following her, and she's Jewish.
Yes, you gotta think in terms of tribes now.
Right. It wasn't a ceremony, you didn't take a class, did they become circumcised? Possibly, if they weren't already. But nobody tells us about that. The only one we know about is the Khazar kingdom in the 8th century, where the king converts and everyone in his kingdom follows suit, and they're all circumcised. All the males got circumcised.
Was this the time period where there were Jewish communities all around the Mediterranean? And not just in Judea or Israel?
So you're like Antioch and Alexandria
and a lot of other places.
Cairo and all of those places. There are probably not at this time, but during this period. So the Alexandrian Jewish community probably begins around the time of the Macedonians and their conquest of the Fertile Crescent. So it's about 300 BCE, right? Or 400 BCE. Were they there at 800 BCE? I don't think so. No.
How did the Pilgrim Festival to Jerusalem, what time were they instituted? And did they do anything to centralize, or why didn't they weren't they a stronger magnet to pulling people to Jerusalem and the temple?
Well, I think they were a strong magnet, but if you're living, if you're living 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem, what those communities did is exactly what happens in the Muslim community with the Hajj, where a town will choose one person, and that person will make the pilgrimage, and everyone in the town gets credit for the Hajj. So they would send one person or one family to Jerusalem on behalf of the community in Yennevelt, and everyone in Yennevelt would get credit for the Pilgrim Festival. It's hard to imagine the roads from all over filled. Jerusalem couldn't handle it anyway. But they were still focal points until probably the destruction of the First Temple. After the destruction of the First Temple, I don't believe the temple was a focal point anymore. Even though there was a second temple, there is much evidence of synagogue life out in the world, beginning with the destruction of the First Temple.
So if, by treaty, by expansion of kingdom, you had more Jews, but you already had your 12 original tribes. Did you have 13 tribes, 14 tribes?
No, so all those, according to Talmudic law, a convert is by definition a member of the tribe of Israel. So, all those, expansionist kingdoms are all in the north. All right?
That's where the expansion.
Right. So when the kingdom crumbles, when Solomon's rule crumbles, what happens to all those kingdoms that were only connected to Jerusalem through Solomon? Did they disappear? Did they reconvert back to what they were? Did they fade off into the wilderness, right off into the sunset? History doesn't really tell us a whole lot because we don't really know a whole lot about all the wives of Solomon and their kind of, communities. There's never a place where they're named or listed. We only know they exist because the text says Solomon had 200 and some odd wives, 800 and some odd concubines.
I figure maybe during the tribe of Benjamin, it's that Solomon's tribe, like extension.
But they're all way out there. And so they're all disconnected.
It seems that they were part of, Israel, but not necessarily Jewish with allegiances to values other than you had a powerful king, happened to be powerful through treaties, happened to be powerful by keeping his wife happy, wives happy. But once that, disappeared, is there any evidence that there was, ethical unification and something like the prophets, might have talked about, or once the king was gone, they just went on their way, found another.
I think that's more the case. Once the king was dead, and the kingdom dissolved, because really that's what happens. Solomon's kingdom dissolves. I think all those people went back to what they were doing before. The question is, and this is kind of the next step. We have this kind of model in political science of balance of power. And at any given point, there's one power that overwhelms all other powers. And these are the four powers from the period of, prior to the kings through the destruction of the temple. You have Egypt, Israel, Assyria, and Babylon. After this period, you have another power, you have Persia. And then you have Rome.
Who were the Phoenicians?
So the Phoenicians were a power that were seafaring peoples that lived along the Mediterranean. The reason why they're not really a power is because they never really drifted far off the coast. So they controlled some shipping lanes, and clearly, even at the time of Solomon had to pay off the Phoenicians so that they could float barges down the Mediterranean from Lebanon. The Philistines were a power really in the period between Egypt and Israel. Where probably the 12th century may have been more about the Philistines than Israel. We could add them into the mix, but then they disappeared as well once David killed Goliath.
For me, out of all those names, the least well-known is Assyria.
Right. So here we know Egypt. Egypt was a power, Israel left, something happened. Even Egyptian history records some things that happened in the 13th century that caused a great conundrum. And it could be the leaving of their slave labor, which was Israel, or it could be a plague, which were the plagues. Whatever it was, Egypt says, Egypt marks something that happens. After Egypt, Israel becomes the next great power, and it controls that central piece of the Fertile Crescent. First as a unified force under Saul, then David, then Solomon. And then after Solomon dies, Israel loses power. Even though we have the divided kingdom, two is not better than one. Because those two were often at loggerheads with each other. The civil war that preceded Solomon returned. This time, second time, the first time it was over political leadership. The second time it was over faith. Right? After Israel, we get to Assyria. Now, who was Assyria? While Israel was caught up in the infighting of the divided kingdom and this whole faith story, Assyria is a northern community. What we would say today is northern Syria, southern Turkey, somewhere at the headwaters of Abraham's journey. Abraham was originally from Ur. So if you go north, and you keep going north, you get to a town called Ur. And the Assyrians were a people that lived up there. And for this period of time, the Assyrians became powerful. In the vacuum created by the loss of Egypt, by the disassociation of Israel, Assyria is the next time. Assyria had a general. The general was a guy named Sennacherib. Sennacherib was particularly powerful, and he had an army. And Sennacherib led his army on a crusade south. And in 700, so 8th century, the end of the 8th century, in the year 721, Sennacherib defeats the northern kingdom. So he comes, let's go back to our map. So he comes down all the way, destroys Bethel, destroys the temple in Bethel, and stops right here.
Does he get the calf? I just want to know if he got the calf out.
So it's very interesting what happens to the calf. Archaeologists believe that during the conquest of Sennacherib, during the war, the calf was spirited away by the priests that served the temple in Bethel. And instead of going south with it, because they couldn't go south with it, they went somewhere up here to the Hula Valley near a place called Dan. All right? And they hid it in the town of Dan, in the Hula Valley, which is up on the kind of the Lebanese border, at the headwaters of the Jordan River. And archaeologists have been digging there for about 50 years.
No calf.
No calf yet.
No calf yet.
Why did he stop the order of something?
All right, so here's the story as it's told in the text. So Sennacherib and his army comes down here. They pause, they stop there. 721, the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, they're gone. Those are the 10 lost tribes. All right, where did they go? They fled in all directions. All right? year, and now he is going to rebuild his army and attack Judah. There's this guy in Judah whose name is Isaiah. And he gets a call from the king one day, and the king says, Isaiah, we got a problem. We got this big army north of us. We've got us. We need your help. Isaiah's a prophet. So Isaiah goes to the front lines, and he prophesies a curse on the armies of Sennacherib. And according to the text, in the middle of the night, 185,000 Assyrians died. Right? Now, if you wake up in the morning and you're one of the ones left, and you see this sea of death, what are you going to do? You're going to vomit us back up to Assyria and say, Kanud, no more, I'm done, the money's not worth it.
Or go down south and make friends?
Well, they could, but they didn't. So, in the year 701, so the period of time between the destruction of this and the attempted destruction of the south, 20 years, they're sitting here. Assyria is controlling the north. Judah's in the south. 10 tribes are lost. Assyria ceases to exist in 701. Right? The destruction of this loss of 185,000 people through a plague. It was probably food poisoning, but we won't go there. Shouldn't have been eating that camel meat. Even if they tell you it's beef, it's still camel meat. So Isaiah saves the south. He saves the temple from destruction, 701. So now the south is going to grow. It's going to thrive from 700 till the next power. So the next power is Babylonia. So when Assyria hits the wall at the end of the 8th century, Babylonia becomes the next power.
And where is that based,
Iraq, Iran. Iraq is really a better location. And so Babylonia becomes the preeminent power. You know, it has no competition. You know, so Israel's been decimated, Assyria's been decimated, Egypt's been decimated. You know, Persia's not there yet. So it's really Babylonia, and they're going to be the ones for the next 150 years who are going to 200 years who are going to rule the roost. And Babylonia begins building its army for a conquest.
Were any of these transitions accompanied by a change of military, either strategy, tools, technology, things like that? Like for example, the Greeks had 1,000, and that's what led them to be a great conquerors. They changed attack.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if there's anything of that nature.
That I don't know. So at the beginning of the 7th century, so we're thinking, 600s, we have the beginning of the growth of Babylonia into a military power. They begin to spread their wings. And through the 7th century, that happens till they get to the 6th century. And in the 6th century is when they come marching eastward or westward. Why are they going to march westward? Because Israel controls the trade routes going west through the Mediterranean. And that's why everybody wanted to control Israel because, you know, seaports and water access, and if you're moving materials east or west, you need those. And so this guy Nebuchadnezzar decides in the 6th century to head west. And the next part of the story is the story of Babylonian destruction. Nebuchadnezzar was not content on occupying. He was much more intent on eradicating, removing, replacing us with people who were loyal to him. There's a reason. Remember our political reality of force, of stretching force? That in order for Nebuchadnezzar to hold on to Israel, which was far away from his home base, it would take much more people than he had at his disposal. So it was better to simply remove Israel from our land and take us back as slaves. Then leave his people in Jerusalem. And that's exactly what he did. He may have been a wise tactician, knowing that he couldn't control the trade routes to feed his soldiers so far away, while worrying about the indigenous population. He simply removed the indigenous population. We went back to Babylonia, and there we sat as we wept and remembered Zion.
Do you know if he did that to any other groups?
I wouldn't be surprised, but I have no,
He did. It was common practice.
Yeah. So Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple, completely plows it under, as a visible symbol to the Israelites. He carries us away in slavery back to Babylonia.
How do you do that? How do you remove everything?
No.
Yeah, you can walk down the road.
Let's just think about it.
So that would have been great, except as Nebuchadnezzar stretched his forces to move into Israel, Persia, Nebuchadnezzar's neighbor to the east, Iran, suddenly awoke. And so the king, Xerxes, or as we refer to him, Cyrus, I'm not sure why we call him Cyrus. I like Xerxes better. But Xerxes was the ruler of Persia, builds for himself an army, and attacks Babylonia. Nebuchadnezzar stretched so thin he can't defend it. And in 516 BCE, according to the rabbinic tradition, 70 years to the date of the destruction of the temple, Cyrus says to the Jews, go home.
You said that was 70 years?
70 years.
So it was Nebuchadnezzar the whole time?
586, the temple's destroyed. Well, by Nebuchadnezzar, I mean, the dynasty of Nebuchadnezzar. So the temple's destroyed in 586. Cyrus defeats the Babylonians and sends the Jews back. Here's the rub. Of the 100%, if there were 100% of Jews in Babylonia, only 30% went back. Why?
They were in the big city, in the big time, the center of civilization. Why did they want to go back to nothing in the country?
Okay.
Was there intermarriage at that point?
Who knows? I'm sure, but,
But your family's here.
okay.
They may have
Had they
used
converted?
themselves, there's not much to go back to, because chances are Persia didn't go all the way down to the lower, where Israel was. The Babylonians are still there if they were when they were moved and then transplanted with other Babylonians down there.
They converted?
No. So here in Babylonia, we went to two places. Surah Humbedita. Two towns in Babylonia. They became like ghettos. And all the Jews lived in those two towns. And in those towns, well, first they wept as they remembered Zion, they then began to create. And the Jews created a society in the absence of the temple that involved prayer without sacrifice, access to God without a priesthood. They began to create here something that they could never create back here, because in Israel there was only one idea of what the temple and faith was. But now when you're outside of it, when you are suddenly freed from the oppression of absoluteness, they could begin to imagine a world that was not this narrow prism through which they were forced to look, but a wide open lens through which they could create an entirely new response to faith. So I will make the case and defend it to my last dying breath that the exile to Babylonia saved Judaism. And all this talk about the temple in Jerusalem and the tragedy, and we have to beat our breast and sit on the floor on Tisha B'Av is all nourishment. Because no Jews did that. Because if it weren't for that exile, Judaism wouldn't still be here today. I believe. Because what this enabled was the response to the Lord. And historically, that may be the most important outcome of the destruction of the temple.
So that event enabled the Jews to be able to adapt and respond to a wide variety of events.
Right.
Not to be constricted.
They created faith ex nihilo. Out of nothing. They had to create a whole faith structure out of nothing. And the creative process that started, in my view, saved Judaism from itself. And so the Babylonian conquest, exile. So when Cyrus says to these Jews, go back to Jerusalem, and only a third go back, to me that's amazing. And would rather live as a second-class citizen in someone else's land than to live on my own in my own country. Because my faith is so important to me, I can't practice it in Jerusalem.
So the 2/3 that stayed and the 1/3 that left, do they in essence become two different peoples?
Well, so what happens is this group, the Surah and Pumbeditites, create the Talmud. It's called the Babylonian Talmud. The 1/3 that remained, so they went back, they create the second Talmud. Okay. They also then create, as the Babylonian Talmud got much better press than the Second Temple, they created Jerusalem version. So there's two Talmuds. The Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud. The difference between the two is that the Babylonian Talmud is much more intricate and full. The Jerusalem Talmud is very narrow because these people saw Judaism through a very narrow lens. And so when you look at the two, they come to different conclusions sometimes.
How do we get either group saying next year in Jerusalem? One said, nah, I don't want to go. The other one is already there.
So the idea of next year in Jerusalem, even that idea doesn't emerge until a post-Second Temple world. That language, So we're in this period now, and that's where we're going to stop tonight. A third of the people are back in Jerusalem, 2/3 in Surah and Pumbedita. We're in the middle of the end of the 6th century, beginning of the 5th century. Right? Next week, we're going to pick up with the next period of time. And we're going to move really through into what's called the intertestamental period on either side of the year zero.
So when we refer to the Talmud now, what Talmud are you talking
So most people refer to the Talmud, they're talking about this one, the Babylonian Talmud. There are many people who still study and use the Jerusalem Talmud, but it's more of an academic exercise than a real exercise because it doesn't have the depth and the breadth of the Babylonian Talmud. They had to decide everything.
They what?
They had to decide on
They
everything.
created a new society.
And so that's a much more useful document.
And weren't they getting, were they the ones who were getting questions from all over? Eventually?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I couldn't hear what you said again.
They were getting questions from Jewish communities.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Right.
How do we have the Greeks up there at all?
Huh?
Between Persia and Rome, no Greeks?
Well, yeah, the Greeks are up there. We'll have to
They're coming.
We'll get them next week.
Yeah, they're coming.
Yeah, they're coming.
Have no fear.
Thank you all again. Yeah, we'll continue this journey next week.
So,
Travis.